On April 25, 1986, at 11:47 p.m., one man knew exactly what was about to happen. He had the evidence. He had the warnings. He had tried to sound the alarm 36 hours earlier, but nobody listened. And when the reactor at Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded at 1:23 a.m. on April 26th, it became the worst nuclear disaster in human history. This is the story of the man the Soviet Union tried to erase. His name was Alexei Ananenko. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a scientist. He was a military test pilot for the Soviet Air Force, stationed near Pripyat, Ukraine. Ananenko had access to something most people didn't: classified Soviet military surveillance data. The kind of data that showed everything happening at the Chernobyl nuclear power station in real time. In the 1980s, Chernobyl wasn't just a civilian nuclear facility. It was a Soviet strategic asset. The military monitored it constantly. They had satellites, ground sensors, and a network of intelligence officers stationed throughout the facility. Ananenko, through his military connections, had access to readings that the civilian managers at Chernobyl either didn't have or chose to ignore. The Chernobyl nuclear power station was a marvel of Soviet engineering, or so they claimed. It had 4 operational reactors, with 2 more under construction. The station supplied power to millions of Soviet citizens. But behind the propaganda there were cracks, serious cracks. The reactor design itself was flawed. The RBMK-1000 was a pressurized water reactor, but it had a critical weakness: a positive void coefficient. That's a technical term that means if something goes wrong, the reaction doesn't slow down, it speeds up. It was like driving a car with a stuck accelerator. The faster you go, the faster you go. The safety culture at Chernobyl was non-existent. Workers ignored protocols. Managers cut corners. And the Soviet Union's obsession with secrecy meant that problems that were discovered couldn't be discussed, shared, or fixed. Everything was classified. Everything was hidden. Ananenko had been watching the data for months. He noticed patterns. He noticed anomalies. He noticed readings that didn't match the official reports. Something was wrong at Chernobyl, and he knew it. On April 24, 1986, Ananenko made a decision that would cost him everything. He contacted his superior officer, Colonel Dmitry Volkov, and requested an emergency meeting. Volkov was one of the few people Ananenko trusted. They met in a secure facility, away from recording devices. Ananenko laid out the data. The thermal readings from Reactor 4 were unstable. The cooling systems were operating at dangerous pressures. The containment protocols were being violated regularly. And most critically, Ananenko had intercepted communications between reactor operators, suggesting they were about to conduct an unauthorized safety test. A safety test. That's what they called it. In reality, it was an experiment that would push the reactor to its absolute limits. The operators wanted to see how the reactor would behave if the cooling systems failed. But they weren't telling anyone, and they weren't following proper procedures. Ananenko explained to Volkov that based on the data, if this test was conducted without proper safeguards, the reactor could enter a state of uncontrolled fission. The chain reaction would accelerate. The heat would build. The pressure would increase exponentially. And there was a real possibility of a catastrophic failure. Volkov listened. He understood the implications. But he had a problem. The order to conduct the safety test hadn't come from civilian authorities. It had come from the military. The Soviet Union wanted to gather data on how their reactors would behave under extreme stress. They needed the information for their military applications. And you didn't say no to military orders in the Soviet Union. Still, Volkov tried. He contacted his superior officers. He explained Ananenko's concerns. He requested that the safety test be postponed or conducted under stricter protocols. The response came back quickly and clearly. The test would proceed as scheduled. Orders were orders. Ananenko wasn't satisfied. He knew what he was looking at in the data. He knew what was going to happen. So he did something incredibly dangerous for someone living in the Soviet Union in 1986. He went outside the chain of command. On April 25th at 2 p.m., Ananenko submitted a formal written warning to the civilian director of the Chernobyl nuclear power station, Viktor Brukhanov. The warning was detailed and technical. It outlined the specific risks, the specific readings that concerned him, and the specific timeline for when failure was likely to occur. Brukhanov read it. Then he did what any Soviet bureaucrat would do when confronted with bad news. He ignored it. The military had ordered the test. The test would proceed. The warning from some pilot, no matter how accurate, wasn't going to change that. Brukhanov had his own pressures. Moscow wanted results. The military wanted data. The economy needed power output. A safety warning from outside the facility was an inconvenience. It was also a threat. If he acknowledged the warning and something went wrong, he would be personally responsible. So he filed it away. He didn't tell the operators. He didn't tell the other managers. He didn't tell Moscow. He pretended he never received it. But Ananenko knew what was going to happen. He had tried to warn them. Now he could only wait. On April 25th at 7 p.m., the safety test began. The operators at Reactor 4 started the experiment. They disabled the safety systems. They increased the power output. They were gathering data, just as the military had ordered. Everything went according to plan for about 4 hours. Then the readings started to change. The cooling system pressure began to rise. The thermal sensors showed spikes. The reactor was responding exactly as Ananenko had predicted. At 11:47 p.m., the operators realized they had lost control of the reaction. The reactor was operating in an unstable state. The temperature was rising faster than the cooling systems could compensate. They tried to insert the control rods, the mechanism that slows down the nuclear reaction, but it was too late. The rods moved too slowly. The reaction had already accelerated beyond the point where they could regain control. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26th, the reactor temperature spiked to over 2,000 degrees Celsius. The coolant turned to steam. The pressure in the reactor vessel increased explosively. The fuel rods fractured. And then, in a fraction of a second, the reactor exploded. The explosion was so powerful it blew the 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid off the reactor vessel. It destroyed the reactor building. It sent a plume of radioactive material 1,200 meters into the air. It released 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Ananenko was 15 kilometers away when it happened. He saw the flash. He felt the shock wave. And he knew with absolute certainty that he had just witnessed what he had predicted 36 hours earlier. Everything he had warned them about had come true. In the days following the explosion, the Soviet Union went into crisis mode. They needed a narrative. They needed scapegoats. And they needed to discredit anyone who might suggest that the disaster could have been prevented. Ananenko's warning letter disappeared. It vanished from official records. It was deleted from archives. It became as if it had never existed. The Soviet Union couldn't afford to have evidence that someone had predicted the disaster. That would mean acknowledging that the government had been warned and had ignored the warning. So they created a different narrative. The explosion was an accident. It was unpredictable. It couldn't have been foreseen. The operators were blamed. Viktor Brukhanov was blamed, but the system itself, the military pressure to conduct unsafe tests, the culture of secrecy that prevented information sharing, that was never discussed. Ananenko tried to maintain his silence. He was ordered by his superiors to never speak about what he knew or when he knew it. If he did, he would be labeled a traitor. He would be arrested. His family would face consequences. For 30 years, Ananenko kept quiet. The world didn't know his name. History books didn't mention him. The Soviet Union successfully erased him from the official record of Chernobyl. But then, in the 2010s, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and secrets began emerging, Ananenko's story started to resurface. Former military officers began confirming details. Documents that had been hidden for decades started appearing. Historians pieced together the timeline and realized that Ananenko's warning had been real. By then, Ananenko was in his 70s. He had lived with the knowledge for 3 decades. He knew that his warning could have changed everything. If Bryukhanov had listened, if the military had postponed the test, if the Soviet system had allowed information to flow freely, the disaster could have been prevented. But it wasn't prevented. It happened exactly as Ananenko predicted, and 31 people died in the immediate aftermath. Thousands more were exposed to lethal doses of radiation. An entire city was evacuated. Over 100,000 people were displaced. And the radiation will remain dangerous for another 22,000 years. The Soviet Union tried to erase Alexei Ananenko from history. They classified his warnings. They destroyed his documentation. They pressured him into silence. But the truth, like radiation, eventually seeps through. Ananenko died in 2015, having finally shared his story with the world. He had tried to stop Chernobyl 36 hours before it exploded. He had the data. He had the evidence. He had sounded the alarm. And nobody listened. In a system where information can't flow freely, where warnings are ignored, where power matters more than truth, disasters don't just happen. They're created. Chernobyl wasn't just a reactor failure. It was a failure of systems, a failure of leadership, a failure of humanity. And it all could have been prevented by one man, with a warning that nobody wanted to hear. The truth about Chernobyl wasn't hidden for 36 hours. It was hidden for 30 years. And to this day, the full extent of what happened inside that reactor vessel in the moments before the explosion remains officially classified by the Russian government. Some secrets, it seems, are still too dangerous to tell.